Welcome into a Bring Me the Sports WNBA Draft Extra. Jonathan Harrison here, joined by Matthew Coller. So, the WNBA Draft is just a couple days away now, Coller. The Lynx have the second overall pick in the draft. Who should they be looking for at the top of this year's WNBA draft class?
It has been a while for Cheryl Reeves since she's had a draft pick this high. And you know what? In the past, the Lynx made a lot of draft picks like this when they built their iconic dynasty team before. So I think that this is a decent year to be picking number 2 overall because the long projected number 1 overall pick is expected to be Aaliyah Boston out of South Carolina. And that leaves the Lynx with, I think, a clear cut player at number 2 who is just a cut above a lot of the other prospects coming out in this draft, and that is Diamond Miller of Maryland. She is 6'3". She's a track runner. She came back healthy this year after an injured season and really, turned around the Maryland team that was kind of put together with a little bit of tape and glue in their offseason with a lot of new players and so forth. And she made them an extremely competitive team. She's one of the fastest players. She finishes at the basket. She plays extremely hard, a great competitor, and also can shoot a little from the outside. It's something part of her game that she needs to improve a little bit. She still is a raw prospect where there's probably too many turnovers, but for somebody to be her size, her speed, her athletic ability, and her competitive nature, her coachability, all of these things to me make her one of the 2 elite prospects in this draft that the Minnesota Lynx should be looking at. Now, if they did consider something like trading down for extra draft capital, this is a team that is in transition very much with their roster. If that was in consideration, I don't think it should be, but if it is, there are some other intriguing players like Jordan Horston out of Tennessee, who has great size and length that is very unique. You won't find it very often. Maddie Siegrist has moved up a lot of draft boards as a lot of the better prospects honestly have chosen to stay in college, which we're seeing as a trend for a lot of players. But Maddie Siegrist from Villanova dominated this year, was one of the best scorers that actually college basketball has ever seen. And so she has moved up a lot of draft boards as well. But I think that this is kind of a top 2, and then the rest, and every mock draft you'll see will have Aaliyah Boston number 1, Diamond Miller number 2 for good reason. But the team with the number 1 pick, Jonathan, they do some strange things sometimes in these drafts. The Indiana Fever have shocked us before, and if they do not pick Aaliyah Boston and they go with someone else, maybe Diamond Miller, maybe a completely different pick, then that could leave the Lynx with a chance to get their Sylvia Fowles replacement. But I think with this one, it is so clear-cut that we will see Diamond Miller be paired with Nafisa Collier. And I think that is a heck of a combination if that's what they end up with 2 very fast, very coachable, very skilled players to build around this Lynx roster.
So the second overall pick is one of 5 overall picks that the Lynx have in the upcoming draft, and 3 in the top 16. The other 2 in the top 16 are 12 and 16. Who should they be looking for in that range when those picks come up?
Yeah, they're going to have a lot of options, and there is a lot of disagreement within the mock draft community for how this is all going to play out, because there's some very projectable players that maybe didn't have the best statistics in college, like Letitia Amihir is one out of South Carolina, where she wasn't even a starter, but she's such an incredible athlete that she is projected to grow at the WNBA level, and even ESPN's mock draft has her in the top 10. That could be a player that drops a little bit to the Lynx and they see as a developmental type of player. Bree Beal is another South Carolina player that was incredible defensively, but needs to develop a better shot if she's going to be a quality player in the W. And then there could be opportunities to get some smaller but more skilled players, especially Zaya Cook, another South Carolina player. They're losing a lot of talent in this draft, but don't worry. I'm sure that they'll figure out a way to refill that roster. But Zaya Cook is an extremely intriguing player to me. She was basically all of South Carolina's offense, but is being mocked toward the back end. There's also a few Big Ten players that are interesting as well. Grace Berger out of Indiana, who is more of a mid-range jumper type of player, but that actually fits really well with what the Lynx like to do offensively. Leah Brown is kind of a hard-nosed player that scored a ton for Michigan this year. Taylor Mikesell is another one out of Ohio State who is a three-point sharpshooter that the Lynx might be intrigued by. So there is a lot of good options. I think actually a strong part of this this draft is coming out of that first round and into the early part of the second.
And follow up with what we just saw over the last month in the tournament with all the incredible talent available in next year's draft class. Because a lot of the players that start in the tournament, Angel Reese, Caitlin Clark, the one who didn't start because she was injured, Paige Beckers, all these players aren't available in this draft because of rules. They're available next year. Should the Lynx think about tanking so they can get up at the top of the draft next year?
Yeah, I don't think you're ever going to see Cheryl Reeves say we're going to lose games on
Right.
purpose. And with a player like Nafisa Collier, who is that foundational player to their franchise, and then adding more talent at the top of the draft, I think that you're not looking at a team that's going to win 4 games or something like that. However, when you look at the landscape of the WNBA and even how free agency played out, where the Lynx chased someone like Breanna Stewart, she ended up not coming to Minnesota. Their roster as is probably not a playoff roster. And it's very interesting the way that the WNBA and then their draft lottery is figured. It's actually your 2-year record. And then if you miss the playoffs, and that's kind of how it plays out. So the Lynx would have a chance if they miss the playoffs again to get a pretty high draft pick. And as you mentioned, in that draft, and there still is the potential for Caitlin Clark to stay another year if she chooses to. Those COVID years are throwing everything off in every draft, actually, where there's older players coming out or players playing those extra years in college. But the way it's projected right now, it would be very favorable for them to draft a player like Diamond Miller. Nafisa Collier is still young. Rebuild the foundation. I mean, the original Lynx dynasty did not happen overnight. It took a few years to get your Simone Augustus, to get your Maya Moore, to trade for Lindsay Whalen, to build that up, to acquire Sylvia Fowles. It takes years a lot of times, and I think nobody knows that better than Cheryl Reeves. So yes, you want to have a long-term outlook, but also if you know Cheryl Reeve at all, you know their team's going to compete. But I think it's going to be a lot like last year where they just really didn't have the horses to actually compete for a championship. And then you have to live in reality where you're at. But next year's draft, I mean, it could go. There's even more players than you mentioned. Elizabeth Kitley was projected as a top 5, top 6 player. She's staying at Virginia Tech. She took that team to new heights in the Final Four, and she's 6'6". So almost no matter what happens with the Lynx, if you get even in the top 6 or 7, you could have a chance at a really, really terrific player. The WNBA over these next 2 years is really going to be reshaped by a lot of these young players coming out, especially Paige, Caitlin, and Angel Reese.
Absolutely. That's been a WNBA Extra for Bring Me the Sports. For all the latest on all things Minnesota sports, check out Bring Me the Sports. Talk to you next time.